Okay, so we're gonna kind of continue in the theme, but change focus just a little bit. And we're gonna go back to the 1920s and really even a little earlier than that. So we can talk about the passage of the 19th Amendment, what led up to it, how all of that came about and how Kansas was impacted by it. And I'm so pleased that we have such a wonderful panel today. We're going to hear from Joan Wagnon, who's going to give us a little bit of background, and then Joan is going to introduce her panelist, who will be able to continue our discussion and enlarge on the discussion about what really was the outcome of the passage of the 19th Amendment and what went into getting it passed. Again, I want to remind everybody that we welcome your questions and comments. So by all means, put them in the chat box, and we've been trying to monitor it and try to get them to the people who are speaking. So we'll continue to do that. So first, let me introduce Joan Wagnon. Joan served 12 years in the Kansas House of Representatives. She served for 8 years as Secretary of Revenue under Governor Sebelius, and she was the first mayor of Topeka and served in that role for 4 years. She's had a long career as the executive director of the Topeka YWCA, but she's also worked as a bank president and an executive vice president at a tax calculation software company. Since retirement, she's volunteered with many organizations, including the Girl Scouts of America and the League of Women Voters, where she served on the exhibit committee of the League of Women Voters Centennial Celebration. And Joan is going to be sharing with us today some of that work. The most important thing that I think you should all know about Joan is that she is truly a force of nature. I am so happy to have the opportunity to introduce my former colleague and my friend, Joan Wagnon.
Thank you so very much, Deb. This is going to be a fun morning for me to get to talk about a topic that I dearly love. When the League of Women Voters came to me and asked if I would help put an exhibit together that could travel across the state and be seen to help people understand the importance of voting and the history that went behind it, I was absolutely delighted to say yes to that. So my initial role was chairing the exhibit committee. And one of the panelists this morning that's going to join us shortly is Terri Finneman, Dr. Finneman. And she was also on that committee, as were a number of historians, so that they could help us focus on Kansas women. Some of you may be concerned about my background and wondering why I've got the White House back there, but what's really back there are the silent sentinels, and you'll see another slide on them in a few minutes. So let me give you a quick reprise of our exhibit, which has now traveled in every corner of the state, most of the regional areas, and has been viewed by over 60,000 people. It is something that the League of Women Voters is very, very proud of. So at this point, I'm going to share my screen with you and start the, anyway, the 19th Amendment and the struggle was not nearly as inclusive as people might have thought. And I sort of bristle when I hear people say this amendment gave women the right to vote, because in reality, it was hard fought and nothing was given to anyone. White women could vote in 1920. In reality, not many did that first year. And women of color would not be able to vote for many more years because of state restrictions. We will look back at some of the main players in this fight and especially focus on Kansas. Some will be familiar names and some will not. And the exhibit really focuses on Kansas and its role within the larger context. This is an example of what the exhibit looked like when it was set up. This happens to be at the Tonganoxie Public Library. And you can see that it's got 7 large 7-foot panels. It's about 25 feet in length. The gallery card that you got in the mail is shown right there. And the end of the exhibit was always, what will you do with your vote and why? And the reason for that was to get people to focus on the election, which I think we actually did a good job of that. To give you just a little bit of the history, the timeline across the bottom here really points out that this only happened in small steps. It started with the 1848 Women's Rights Conference in Seneca Falls, and following that, about 10 years later, in Lynn County, Kansas, you all know where that is, Lacine, places like that. In the Monica Women's Rights Association convened 10 years later in 1958, and it outlined a group of rights that women did not have. Some of the things that they said, because woman is a social being and she has all the relations of life to sustain which belong to an associated condition of existence, and because she is a progressive, being ever outgrowing the past and demanding a higher and greater future. In other words, because she is a human being and as such endowed by her creator with the full measure of human rights, and because the present arrangement of the world, she is shut out of colleges and the higher order of educational institution and deprived of opportunities for intellectual improvement, shut out from lucrative professions and the mechanic arts, and deprived of facilities for accumulation of wealth. She's made subject to laws which she had no voice in making, and which deprive her of ownership of her property and of herself, and give even her daily earnings to the control of others. And it goes on with a long list of things that women needed to have as rights. And that was the first time in Kansas that women started looking at their own rights. The next thing that happened was that they began to pass small steps where women's rights were gained. It took until 1912 for a vote to be taken in the Kansas legislature so that women could vote in state elections. They still couldn't vote in federal elections, but we became the 7th state in the nation where women achieved full suffrage. We loved this picture of the car because that's Lila Day Monroe and a group of her friends in Topeka displaying their banner, Votes for Women. She organized hundreds of men and women to push for suffrage for Kansas women in the general election of 1912. Their campaign was funded by balloon sales, and thousands of women whose small contributions, like selling extra eggs or a day's worth of sewing, combined to redefine democracy in Kansas. It took from 1912 in Kansas to 1919 for Congress to pass an amendment, and to 1920 before full suffrage was gained. Some of the suffrage leaders in Kansas are people that deserve some attention. Susanna Salter, she's pictured here in the center, was the first woman mayor in the United States from Argonia, Kansas. She was elected in actuality as a joke because the women got together and said, we can vote and we're going to elect all women. And soon after, women were able to vote in city elections in 1887. And with the Prohibition Party, they got active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The woman on the right is Mamie Dillard, and Deborah Dandridge will be talking with you more about her, but she is an African-American temperance leader from Lawrence, and she was encouraging Black women to join the Black temperance groups to get leadership opportunities. And there was a strong tie between suffrage and temperance and abolition. On the left, Clarina Nichols is one of the real pioneers. She wasn't from Kansas. She uprooted her family from the East and moved to Kansas to become a pioneer and an activist. She couldn't vote, but after the Monica Rights Convention in Lynn County, she attended at their request the Wyandotte Constitutional Convention as an observer. And while she sat in the back and knitted quietly, she talked with people. And she was able to convince those initial framers of the Kansas Constitution that women needed rights, particularly holding property and an equal right with fathers for the custody of their children. The first state legislature under this Constitution was the legislature that authorized women to vote in school elections in 1861. One of the interesting things to me about the study of the suffrage movement was the connection between racism and suffrage. And it particularly is apparent now when we're seeing so much in our public lives talking about racism and the insidious effects that it has. But racism was an underlying factor throughout the suffrage movement. And African-American women played a crucial role in getting women the right to vote and to run for office. They just didn't do it alongside the famous white women that got most of the credit. So they worked in other areas that were more hospitable to them. Temperance, in some areas, colored women clubs. And again, during our panel, we'll talk a little more about this. Non-white women still couldn't vote for some time. Native Americans, 1924, Asian Americans, 1952. It was the civil rights movement of 1965 that finally got at the inequality that is there, because constitutionally, states have the right to set their election rules, and election rules, particularly in the South, were not favorable to participation of African Americans. If you stop for a moment and take a look at some of the national leaders, there are two women who stand out. Carrie Chapman Catt led the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She's the formidable appearing woman on the left. And Alice Paul broke from that group and formed the National Women's Party. And she is the woman on the right. Alice Paul's background was that she spent several years as a graduate student in England, and she participated with the suffrage efforts there. And she had a much different approach on how suffrage should be approached politically. Carrie Chapman Catt worked with the other national leaders from an earlier era, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But the ultimate path to victory was focusing on individual state suffrage combined with work towards a constitutional amendment. And Alice became the person who pushed for, following suffrage, the Equal Rights Amendment. But I love the picture that you're going to see next. It's about the silent sentinels at the White House. And because Alice was pretty fearless, she challenged President Woodrow Wilson, who was running for re-election, to come out and support women. And she organized this group of silent sentinels who stood for days and months to try to impress upon Woodrow Wilson the importance of suffrage for women. He finally, after Alice's silent sentinel stood long enough in front of the White House, convinced him that he needed to vote for suffrage and to push for suffrage, which he did. I like this map because it really highlights that Carrie Catt's strategy was to work with the Western states first, where resistance to suffrage was lower. And you can see on this map the progression of states towards suffrage. Mrs. Catt believed that slow and steady progress was the correct strategy to pass a suffrage amendment in Congress and eventually to see it ratified by the states. To her, it made sense that you had this group of states who would already have passed suffrage, Kansas among them. You can see in the list, it started with Wyoming in 1869, and you can follow down through Colorado, Utah, Idaho, California, Oregon, and Kansas in 1912. The League of Women Voters came about because Carrie Catt thought women needed a structure that could educate them about what the political process was about. And so she formed the League and tapped Jane Brooks, a woman from Wichita, Kansas, to be the very first president of the League of Women Voters. And the League involved itself then in numerous issues. They're totally nonpartisan. And I think that was really the big difference between Alice Paul and Carrie Catt, that Carrie Catt thought if they got involved in partisan politics, they would not be as successful. So they work on issues, they're activists, but it's always nonpartisan. And school desegregation, civil rights, Title IX, the Equal Rights Amendment, which they supported and unfortunately did not pass. Only one woman out of three actually cast a vote in 1920. Politicians responded to the newly enlarged electorate by emphasizing issues of special interest to women, like prohibition, child health, public schools, and world peace. Women did respond, but not in the same general voting way that men did. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Act that women became active again in pushing for voting rights, for equal rights amendment, and a host of other things. So this was the conclusion of the exhibit and the conclusion of my presentation at this point. The whole point of taking this across the state of Kansas into libraries, and schools, any place that would host it, was to encourage people to vote and to think about what they would do with their vote in 2020. We didn't support candidates, but we supported political involvement, better known as civic engagement. So I'm going to stop the screen sharing now, I think, and introduce the panel that we've got. Is Deborah Dandridge with us? There's Deborah. We have two women to join me in talking about some of these things who really understand the suffrage movement and understand the era that we're involved in. Terri Finneman is an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of Kansas. She's worked before as a print journalist and a multimedia correspondent covering state government, business, and enterprise. Her research focuses on news coverage of US First Ladies and women politicians, as well as the suffrage movement. She's the author of Press Portrayals of Women Politicians, 1870 to 2000, and was named a 2016 finalist for the Frank Luther Mott Capita Alpha Book Award for Best Research. based on journalism or mass communication. Terri, thank you for taking time this morning to join us. Is there anything else you want to tell us a little about yourself?
I'll get to that when I start my talk. That's good for now.
Okay. And Deborah Dandridge, also from KU, is a native from Topeka, and I've worked with Deborah on a number of programs in the past. And she attended Washington School, which is one of the city's 4 elementary schools designated for African Americans. She was there from 51 to 57. After she got out of elementary school, she served on the U.S. history faculty at Washburn University, and later as an instructor in U.S. history and African American history at KU. Since 1986, she's been the archivist for the African American collections in Spencer Research Library. In 2008, she received the Beauty Distinguished Librarian Award, the 2013 James E. Butler Civil Rights Award from the Kansas Human Rights Commission, and the 2020 Dorothy Porter Award from the Association for the Study of African American History and Life. Deborah, you've got a whole string of.
Yeah, well, you didn't have to do that.
Yeah, I did. So, do you want to tell them any more about you or what you do at KU?
No.
Okay. Well, we're just going to have a wide open discussion about suffrage, what happened, and what happened after 1920 when the amendment passed. I hope all of you will use your gallery card that we gave to you. I'm not sure it's going to show up here. It's the very purple thing, and take a look at that. So, Terri, if I could start with you, what are some of the interesting facts of the suffrage movement that most people don't know?
Sure. Okay. So first off, I will start that I could talk for 90 minutes on this topic. And so if you're interested in learning more, I was part of a new book that came out this spring called Front Pages, Front Lines, Media and the Fight for Women's Suffrage. And then my other book, which is related, is Press Portrayals of Women Politicians. So if you're interested in hearing more, feel free to ask your local library to get that book or check it out yourself. And then I run a podcast called Journalism History, and recently tied in the election of Kamala Harris into the broader scheme of women's history. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, feel free to check out the Journalism History podcast. But as far as little known stories, I think the first one is that I'll touch upon, I'll give you several examples here, is that most people start the history of the suffrage movement in 1848 with Seneca Falls. And in my lectures, I tend to start in 1840 instead, and discuss Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who attended the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton was actually on her honeymoon at the time. So imagine spending time on your honeymoon, going to the Anti-Slavery Convention, and essentially starting a massive social movement as a result. So these women were at this convention, and they were told that because they were women, they were not allowed to participate. And they were really not happy about that. And so this kind of started the inklings of the suffrage movement due to their exclusion in this. And, you know, related to this, this is what Joan was talking about in her talk, is that I think the biggest problem with the history of the suffrage movement as it's taught to kind of a general public is that the storyline is Susan B. Anthony and some of her friends got together and they worked really hard for a long time, and then they got women the right to vote, and that was great. Okay, that seems to be what the suffrage movement is often boiled down to. What really is what Joan was talking about, this is an extremely complicated story of racism, classism, sexism, generational differences, that did not stop in 1920, but continue into today. We continue to see that same battle into today. It's not just something from 100 years ago in the past. So 1840, another story that I think really gets left out is the influence of Native American women on the suffrage movement. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott come back from London. They come back home again. and they lived near Iroquois. And, Mott spent a lot of time among the Seneca people, and Stanton had frequent contact with her Native American neighbors, and they observed Native women and the amount of power that they had in their cultures. And Mott saw women with an authority she would not even have been able to imagine in white women's culture. Native American women were involved in decision making. They had a lot of power. And so I think the story of Native American women and their influence on the white suffrage leaders tends to get left out. Another major moment that tends to be overlooked is Victoria Woodhull, who I focus on in my book, Press Portrayals of Women Politicians. She was the first woman to run for president in 1872. Another woman who has been excluded from history, and nobody knows that fact. And she was the first woman to testify before Congress, arguing that the 14th and 15th Amendments should give women the right to vote. Of course, that did not happen, but she became a pretty major political figure for a few years and involved in the suffrage movement, even though she's been written out of history. Another thing that I really like to drill in for people to think about, because I think we think about this just a little too abstractly, right? So you hear 1848, 1920, but really stop and think about this. Think hard on this. A woman's suffrage amendment was first introduced in Congress in 1878. So officially, this is now in Congress's ballpark to deal with. 41 years. It took 41 years for Congress to take this up and not just screw around in committees and do little with it. This is appalling. This is appalling how long it takes our government to give people basic rights in this country. So I really try to drill in that point. The role of Congress in this was really quite despicable for a number of years.
Terri, someone just asked in the chat, what was the name of the first women president candidate?
Oh, Victoria Woodhull.
Victoria Woodhull.
Victoria Woodhull, yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I love Victoria Woodhull. I could talk for an entire hour just on her. So book me again and I will talk all about her.
We'll do some more. I'm going to come back to you in just a minute, and you can tell more stories. We can talk about the role that the media played. But right now, I want to go to Deborah, if we can. And Deborah, one of the things that was shocking to me as I started digging into it, and it shouldn't have been, was the rampant racism that was going on both in the fight for suffrage and after. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. And this is not the first time sisters have worked together to advance the civil rights, because it was the abolitionist movement that Black women and white women had worked together in that advocacy. And in fact, white women honed their political skills within the abolitionist movement. So a lot of them had worked together, not necessarily as equal, but they had certainly been a part of it. So when it comes down to whether or not they are participating as leaders or as advocates, it really rolls down to that pernicious notion and practice of race that our nation, and it persisted from the abolitionist movement into the women's movement starting in the 1870s. So I think, that's one issue to be, I think, emphasized. And one of the leaders of the movement, Mary L. Talbert, she said, "It should not be necessary to struggle forever against popular prejudice. And with us colored women, this struggle becomes twofold. First, because we are women, and second, because we are colored." And I think this is this constant battle going on with them. And often African-American women, when they were participating in the suffrage movement, it was primarily in segregated units. It was rarely, if ever, in an integrated setting. So that's the way in addressing what your question was, Joan, the racism was kind of incorporated into the movement. And a lot of it had to do also, and I'm just going to go the practical way, with politics. Because what is going to convince those men in the state and in our Congress to do something. Are they going to favor whites? Are they going to favor blacks? Well, obviously, whites have the power. So this becomes an issue too, and what you try to place forward. And I think sometimes we charge the white suffragists with being racist, but they were using something that was politically, to me, very politically convenient for them to move on and place suffrage as a priority. As a result of it, Black women were working in their communities all along, developing the social capital. They were always being guided by the movement of to better our world. And that womanist approach would be applied to their participation in the suffrage movement. So we have people like Carrie Langston, whose father was organizing in 1863 in Kansas. He was organizing the African American Convention, and they were advocating for the civil rights of African Americans. And one of them was demanding the vote, but he decided that in the politics of it, he decided to say, we'll just go with men. He was one of those that was a strong advocate. We'll go with men because that's what's going to be more convincing when they were doing with the amendment. That would be more convincing to Congress than to add women to it, to add gender to it. So the irony is that it's his daughter, Carrie Langston, who becomes quite a leader in Kansas when talking about advocacy for the vote. And so she is, they're living in Lawrence. She's a graduate of KU. She's a member of the Black middle class, we'll say, of Lawrence. And another woman who is very much a part of it is Mamie Dillard. And Mamie Dillard is a woman, again, they both belong to the same kind of social clubs. They both belong to the Interstate Literary Society. Langston talks about it in The Big C, how he embarrassed his mother when she was delivering her speech before that. But in this whole issue here is that they were very much a part of the movement, but they were doing it, as Joan was saying, in a segregated way. I think the other thing with women in Kansas is that they were advocating in a variety of different ways. They were the ones who were really doing a lot of the support work for men who were running for office. And so Graham County will be one place where with Nicodemus, you'll find the women are really organizing around a lot of the men there who get certain appointments. Then it's people like, and I'm forgetting the name, oh my goodness, Fairfax. Alfred Fairfax, who was our first elected to the state legislature in 1889, I think it was. And Fairfax comes from Louisiana, had participated in the Louisiana legislature before the fall of Reconstruction. And when he comes into Chautauqua County, he mobilizes, gets involved with the Republican Party. All of these are Republican parties. So part of the social networking to better your world was to align yourselves with those in power. And African-American women played a very important role in mobilizing the Black support, African-American male support to get him into office. And I think that with that kind of advocacy, I think is one in which we judge people by their racism. And, Black people, we're the first ones. We know that's the first thing that comes up. But then it becomes what they do in the movement as leaders. It becomes you're making choices. How are you going to get it through first? And I think that's one of the issues I think that comes out, and because the feminist movement, the womanist movement and all of these movements really demonstrate how complex it can be for advocacy of equality of all human beings.
Yeah, that's excellent information. Terri, you spent a lot of time looking at the media and its role in politics. What was the media doing right during this period when suffrage was being considered.
So related to that, and then finishing up my last part, one of the little known stories from the suffrage movement as well is the role that other women played. Women, I just got done blaming Congress, but you know what? Women played a huge role in suppressing their own rights. And that is not talked about enough. I primarily focus on the anti-suffrage movement, which ties into the media coverage and the PR campaigns that were used by other women to not give them the right to vote. So this is Josephine Dodge on the left. She was the daughter of a governor of Connecticut. And this is Alice Wadsworth on the right. She was the wife of a New York senator, and she was the daughter of John Hay, the same John Hay who was Abraham Lincoln's secretary. So you have these white women of extreme privilege trying to block women getting the right to vote. And they were behind the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, which had 25 state associations across the country with at least 350,000 members. So when keeping this in mind, nothing is new. Social media is really not new. Back then, they just used pamphlets. And so they used pamphlets and they circulated that with inaccurate information and like misleading information. So here's a pamphlet from 1894. Of course, religion was used as a main argument why women shouldn't be allowed to vote. God made men and women to do different things and it's blasphemy. You had a lot of pastors involved in that. Another pamphlet from this time, women's morality was a huge part of why women shouldn't get the right to vote because politics would make her dirty. So this is a pamphlet that went around arguing that point, that women would be injured physically if their morality had to be, devastated with the dirtiness of politics. You had letters to the editor being used with the same kind of junk you see on social media today that makes no sense. What's going to happen if it rains or snows or the baby's sick? How are you going to get both men and women to the polls? And then, there aren't enough horses. There are not enough horses to take both men and women to the polls. So this is just crazy. Never mind, there are apparently enough horses to get them to church, but apparently not to the polls, I guess. I don't know. And this is similar to Facebook memes that you would see going around today, where they take a prominent quote. I haven't looked into this. I'm pretty sure it's out of context, where Thomas Jefferson, they're taking a quote from him to argue against suffrage. So nothing is new. Nothing is ever new. Okay, the same kind of thing was going on back in the late 1800s. But showing a little bit more current stuff. So women suffragists also started their own newspapers to get the word out because they were not happy with how the mainstream press was covering them. I am still a journalist. I have been a journalist for 20 years now. I'm the publisher of the Eudora Times newspaper. And one of the things that's interesting to me as both a journalist and as a historian is that we are often accused of being the liberal media, the evil liberal media. When in reality, when you look at this from a historical perspective, the press is extremely conservative and they are often decades behind what a social movement is promoting. So the reality is actually quite opposite of what the belief is when you actually study this kind of coverage. So these women had to start their own newspapers. Now, they did get some positive coverage as it got closer, more into the 1900s. In 1913, there was the first Women's March on Washington. The press thought that this was just wow, right? I mean, they had never seen something like this before. So they called it the greatest of its kind ever witnessed in America, with all of these beautiful women descending on Washington, D.C. to march. So they were pretty enthralled with that. But that wasn't really the end of it. So in this is some negative coverage from the march. These suffragists were referred to as sore-footed bunch of old hens arrive. Okay, so newspapers, of course, predominantly run by men at this time, so you can see how that would make it through. But there was also criticism from other women in the press that suffrage was a disgusting spectacle. Women wanting the right to vote was just a fad, and never mind, it's apparently been a fad since like 1840. So by 1970, it's still a fad, I guess, 1913. And they accused these women of being guilty of the gravest disrespect to their country and its rulers. And you see the same kind of really vicious rhetoric used here. So before I, as a journalist, was an enemy of the people, suffragists were enemies first. So I guess I'm in good company. This is a real headline that ran. Alice Wadsworth, here she is making a cameo again. Suffragists were referred to as enemies of the nation. They were disloyal. They were not patriots during World War I. They were selfish for wanting these rights. They were accused of being socialist. Again, nothing in history is new. We're seeing the same kind of rhetoric today. America First was used during this time. This was a slogan that was used against giving women the right to vote because you needed to put the war effort first, America first, before your own personal needs. Giving women suffrage would have evil effects and be a menace to society. So this same kind of fear-mongering rhetoric that we see today was being used by anti-suffragists back in 1917 when they were grasping, they knew the tide was turning, that suffrage was about to happen. They were grasping and issuing fear to get people to stop progress.
And that just, I know that it's not your period, but that parallel to what went on in 1970s against the Equal Rights Amendment with Phyllis Schlafly and the others who were part of the antis, they're still trying to protect femininity without recognizing that women can stand on their own 2 feet.
But Black women never had that benefit.
Talk about that, Deborah.
But yeah, and they were defined differently, and race defined them differently. And I think, you know, we never pretended, although within the Black community, perhaps to some way, obviously with a lot of the ministers, there were issues, but I'm not sure on a broad scale that was a factor for African-American women in their experiences.
Well, it certainly was politically with what was going on, because that's where I have run across a lot of that with people trying to protect me when I don't need to be protected. But you're right, that was a big difference between the African-American. Terri, you were talking about the indigenous people. Did your research show anything about the Haudenosaunee women?
I have heard other speakers talking about that. I have not delved into that, but yes, I know that there are a lot of experts who have delved into that and their contributions.
There was a small part of our exhibit that had just a little bit of information about the Haudenosaunee, who it's a women-based culture in the Iroquois Nation, where women hold the power, and they, in many ways, some of their democratic principles were baked into the United States Constitution. So
yeah, I'll put in the chat the Washington Post story that does a really good job looking into what I was talking about.
Good. We're also taking questions from those of you who are watching on the chat. If you want to put them in, you can address it for Terri or address it for Deborah, and they'll be happy to talk with you a little about that. I'd like to shift gears enough to start thinking about what happened after the 19th Amendment passed. What happened after 1920? And Deborah, did you see that chat question?
Yes, I did.
Okay. What happened then in terms of the political situation, or in terms of women's attitudes about themselves or acceptance? Anybody want to take a crack at that? While Deborah's working on the chat question, I've got some political information that I would share with you. Politicians figured out soon after women got the vote in 1920 that they could use women and their interest to bring them into the voting fold. And so what they did was start running issues in the urban areas where women's vote in big city machine politics. They thought they needed the support of women to elect Al Smith, and the rural women thought that they wanted to support prohibition, and they were going to be voting for the Republican Herbert Hoover. So the difference in women's attitudes and political choices continued to play out there. It was not, however, until basically 1980 that women were able to turn out to the polls in the same number as men. And that 1980 forward, women have voted in equal or greater numbers than men, but only 1 out of 3 women actually voted after the 19th Amendment passed in that 1920 election. So political parity was a long time in coming. Deborah, you want to take that question and answer it?
Yeah, right. I didn't know if I was trying to write it. I'm just not that good at this. But no, African-American women simply continued with their activism. And I think the question was, there is a direct link. Those women who were often involved in the suffrage movement, you'll find them coming back, and they're involved in, particularly after the Civil War, after the World War II, they're involved in advancing a civil rights agenda that would eventually be taken up, particularly after the '54 decision, and advanced onward. So a lot of them were activists long time before the civil rights movement. So there is definitely, there's a definite thread of link, and some of them will be the same women. Charlotte Bass coming out of California, who had some links to Kansas. She would eventually become running for the Progressive Party. I think it was in the 40s, and she would be one of the first vice president, woman of color vice president on the Progressive Party. So she would be one of them. And so there are others who have that link. So it's very much a part of it. Was there another question?
It was really about the pivotal role that women played in the Civil
Right, yeah,
War.
the pivotal, yeah, women were the organizers. They are the ones that organize it. The Pullman Porters, admittedly, they talk about Alabama. Of course, they, is the male oriented, but the women were the ones who organized the organization. I mean, they were the ones that organized it. They're the ones who were the ones that were getting out the pamphlets, doing the other things. Angela Davis in the Black Panther movement, she's the one that's doing the writing and reaching out and starting the breakfast program. So, the thread of this development, I dare say, stems back at least to the era of chattel slavery.
Yeah. Very good answer. The YWCA was another organization that I was involved with for many years that attempted, along with the League of Women Voters, to develop activism on the part of women. And it also worked with African-American women and focused on trying to bridge that racial divide. And that's the first organization that I know anything about where Black women and white women and women of multiracial groups could come together. And in fact, the YWCA in Topeka in 1946 would allow a multiracial Bible study to take place that was taught by Dr. Carl Menninger's mother. But it was the first time that you could find organizations where they come together. There may be other examples. That's just the one I'm familiar with. Go ahead, Deborah.
The only thing is, in order to become equal members of the local YWCAs, there had to be a segregated. It wasn't in an integrated way. So you had Yates Branch that was established in 1913 in Kansas City, one of the prominent ones that continues. So we have African-American women coming together, but they'll come together in more, general YWCA conferences or something like that. But their units of operation were still very much segregated until, as you were saying, into the 60s.
So school desegregation was an important event when the Supreme Court in 1954 passed its landmark ruling to desegregate public schools. that had to have an impact on women's participation in public life. Or did it?
Yeah, indeed. They were all the enforcement of the decision was made, but you've got to now struggle to enforcement. So that was the civil rights movement. And that meant that all kinds of people coming out of Montgomery, Alabama, and during the bus boycotts, coming out of Baton Rouge, coming out of all of those areas, those were very much organized by women, and many of them were the women that were doing it. So I think that it's very much, they're all linked together. Again, social activism for African Americans, particularly for the women, was a necessity to survive. And that's the way they preserved their lives as well as they advanced their lives. And education was very important to them. So when it came to the 54 decision, Marshall hit on the very thing that was the heart of African Americans. That was their first desire. I mean, that became the first emphasis, and that's the way I can get by. That's the way I can advance myself both individually and as a community. So I think that becomes, very much a core part of the struggle for African American women as social activists. That would even, I hate to use this term, that would even trump the vote. Okay.
Yeah. Terri, there's a question for you asking if you would comment on whether the press covers women in politics differently and whether that's changed, or is there a common approach over many years?
Well, sadly, there is a common approach. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about, when I hear liberal media, I think, no, because especially when it comes to women in politics, it is still an extremely conservative, old-fashioned gender norms clinging to that is used. One of the things that I want to show is, what is happening here? It really goes back to Victoria Woodhull and that first presidential campaign, kind of setting the tone for what women today are still having to deal with. So this is a political cartoon of Victoria Woodhull that ran when she ran for president, and she was referred to as Mrs. Satan. And so a very prominent political cartoonist drew this image to mock her. And so my book chapter on her is called Media Vilification of Victoria Woodhull. And you still see that vilification today, especially with Hillary Clinton, who is also
We've been so lucky today to not have anybody freeze.
Right.
So is she going to unfreeze?
Hopefully, but I think maybe we might move on to another discussion and hopefully she'll.
Okay, Noel Razor raises this question. The huge turnout of women voters in recent decades makes me wonder to what extent the current voter suppression efforts are motivated by gender along with race and class. I feel it's not women we hear railing about stopping voter fraud, but maybe she thinks she's biased.
Sorry, my internet cut out. I'm back. Go ahead.
Do you want to finish your thought on the other? And then I've got another question about voter turnout.
Yeah, so I mean, I was just saying that this vilification frame that started with Victoria Woodhull is still very much present with how women in politics are covered today. One of the things that has changed, that has improved, is that there is much more widespread acknowledgement that women in politics do face additional sexism. There is much more of a recognition that this exists and this is a problem. But this isn't just journalists. I mean, this is cultural, this is the political campaigns, this is the public relations folks. This is all intertwined in our culture. And so it's something that even with Kamala's historic election is not something that's going to evaporate overnight.
Yeah. And the huge turnout of women voters in recent decades, someone is wondering whether the current voter suppression efforts are motivated by gender as well as race and class. And just noted that you don't hear women hollering about voter fraud. At least we haven't yet. Anybody want to comment on that?
I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting, and you've heard this from women in the Senate, is talking about how women senators are much more willing to try to compromise and come together than their male counterparts. And so I think that is something significant that women bring to politics, and probably ties into your question.
I think it is absolutely true. And one of the things I do in my spare time these days is work on oral history. And we're running a series of oral histories on women in the legislature. And we've done conservative women and women in leadership, Republicans, Democrats, all kinds of women. And that one thing that comes out about why do you think women are different than men, and how are they different, is they talk about their collegiality, their willingness to compromise. And you're seeing that among groups all the way from city councils to Congress, where the Women's Caucus in Congress, which is bipartisan, gets together to solve problems. So I think that pretty much is true. Where do you think we are today? I mean, is the unrest that we see in our communities today a good thing or a bad thing? And I want to give you an example. I went down to one of the marches in downtown Topeka, Kansas, which is not exactly a hotbed of protest. And I was particularly pleased to see young women, young men, young women of every color, all working together, just protesting to say we want they were protesting the death of one of the Black people. I think it was the one in Minnesota that had been killed, the George Floyd. But the outrage was shared by young and old, by Black and white and Hispanic. And it looked to me that was a pretty positive sign.
Yeah, and I agree. I was just so inspired when I would see I would go by and see some of them. It's all the generations, and they were younger, but some of the older ones, African American and white, were on the side when they were walking down and protesting. But I think I'm from Topeka too, so I'm sharing your observations, Joan. So I think there's a lot of hope in this, and I just think some of the roles that we talk about in terms of race, in terms of gender, are truly being challenged. And Professor Finneman and all of their studies, the more recent studies are really supporting this and explaining this. And I am a person who thinks it's nice for the academy to do that, Dr. Finneman, but you need to get out there in public policy. And I think that the notion that somehow scholars are people who shouldn't dabble in making public policy. They should be in the center of it. Much of the problems we're facing now, if they were in the center of it, we could have planned out as Germany has done and some of the other countries. Okay, I've gone off, Joan. Stop me.
No, you're fine. I think in the whole political spectrum, the other thing that I watch, and this is not so much about the 19th Amendment, but I watch the changing differences in political parties. And I often think about Carrie Catt in 1920, believing that she had to have the League of Women Voters ready to train women so they could understand politics. And Alice Paul standing there saying, nope, we need to get on the streets, we need to march, we need to do whatever we can to force people to accept change. And knowing what's the right strategy is, as you were saying, Deborah, you were more practical in your watching the approach. But where are we going with all of this now in terms of our political parties? I think the Democratic Party has morphed from the Democrat Party that I grew up in. in the South. And I don't like some of those people anymore, but actually some of them have become Republicans. And the African-American women who were active in the Republican Party are now coming over to the other one. So where do you see us going with political parties, and what kind of organizations do we need to support activism and support the kind of change that we want to see happen in the future? You want to take a crack at that, anybody? It's kind of a broad question.
Professor Finneman is not saying anything.
Could you, I'm sorry, I was reading there's so many comments coming in. Could you repeat the question?
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a morphing of our political parties and of our organizations, and assuming that social change is always going to be happening. We're not static. What do you see the future in terms of those changes that are being made now? And basically, who was right, Carrie Catt or Alice Paul, in terms of affecting social change?
Well, I mean, I think both women played a role. I mean, Carrie Chapman Catt had more of a moderate role, and Alice Paul had more of a liberal role. And I think they both made contributions with that. I mean, with the March on Washington, the Women's March on Washington in 1913, it was interesting because Alice Paul was really promoting that, and the mainstream suffragists weren't in favor of it at all, because they thought it was going to fail and then it would be an embarrassment. And so they basically made her raise her own money for that, and it was basically on her. And then when it went well, then they came in and took credit for that. And when I say it went well, I mean, certainly there were still issues with the march, right? I mean, Alice Paul and the women involved with the march tried to exclude the Black suffragists from being involved in marching, and it wanted them to be in the back. And so there were certainly a number of racist issues with the march as well. But I think all of the women who were involved in the suffrage movement made their own individual contributions that are worthy of being remembered.
Was there any violence in that movement?
Oh, yes. I mean, after the parade, yes, violence did break out, and there were a number of arrests. I mean, certainly with the Night of Terror that happened with the White House picketing, when a number of women were jailed and some of them were beaten in prison. So yeah, there was some violence associated with the suffrage movement as well. And then, of course, Ida B. Wells having her newspaper burned down for coming out against lynching and for her activism with sexism and racism. Yeah, I mean, that was extremely violent to have her newspaper burned to the ground.
Yeah, and didn't she also participate in one of the marches, and they asked her in the backyard? And which march was that?
That was the 1913 parade.
Okay.
Someone put in the chat, those people making public policy need to pay attention to what people want to close the divide. I guess that's, I was wandering around in my question, but I was trying to figure out how you bridge that gap. And I don't know how to do that, because all I see these days is a bigger divide and a more polarized society. And, but closing that divide is important. One final comment, and then we're going to be pretty much ready to close this out. Terry's comment about vilifying women in politics made one of our attendees think about the overwhelming focus on a woman's image and appearance. Sarah talked about this morning with Dolly Parton. But we also saw Hillary's pantsuit nation and Kamala Harris's sneakers. So the question is to both Deborah and Terri, what can women do to pivot the conversation or control the narrative away from their image or to what they want it to be?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I mean, some of these women have taken advantage of that gendered coverage as well. So then it becomes this mixture of, when sexism is problematic, but then when reverse sexism is helpful, which is a whole nother discussion. But I mean, women need to speak out. You need to speak out. And I mean, just in everyday things, right? When you hear somebody you know making a comment about it, you have to speak up and say something, because that's what's needed to make little chipping away at the broader cultural issues that we have. But certainly feeling needing to speak up, you know, to call the newsroom and say, why are you doing this kind of coverage? I mean, the emphasis on women's appearance can go back to 1916 for sure, when Jeanette Rankin was the first woman elected to Congress from Montana. And there were entire articles written about the color of her hair. So we've had this obsession with appearance for like over 100 years now. And it's something that until we continually push back, it's not going to change.
Deborah, do you have a comment?
No, I agree. But I don't think that, you know, you can change the subject just as a strategy. You can change the subject and respond to the issues at hand and ignore those stupid questions, you know, and I think one strategy is just simply ignore it. I mean, do not respond to those questions. Instead, when you answer those things that are dealing with issues. And, that's not going to go away, because so many times the press and a variety of others who are involved, this is men. These are generated by men. These questions and perspectives are often generated by men, and it makes them feel good, it makes them feel comfortable.
Well, I think we will bring this to a close by giving each of our panelists a chance to just make some final closing comment about, I'm not going to limit you, but the significance of that movement on where we are today and where we're going to go in the future.
I guess I would just say that, I mean, I think it's important that the conversations that we're having right now don't go away. We in America tend to have a very short attention span. And when something new pops up, then we forget about, the thing that just happened. And so I think for all of you at this conference, it's important for you to continue these conversations and continue pushing forward and being involved in these conversations about getting more women involved in politics and making sure that they're included, speaking up in your own local communities about voter suppression issues and how accessible voting is in your own communities. Those are the kinds of things that local activism on the ground can really make a big difference.
Yeah.
I can't say that mine is anything profound, but I think it's very significant. I mean, I think it brought people together and to understand that a democracy includes everyone. And that means that, Margaret Mead said that when she was traveling around, all over the world and looking at different communities, that one thing was always this segregation of women. That seemed to be the typical role of all these all of these ethnic groups and a variety of other things. But what the suffrage movement did for me, in my perspective, it advanced democracy to include all human beings. And I think that, the inclusion of African-American men was one step, but to do all of humanity and women as a majority, population-wise, as a world majority, this gives you a sense of what democracy can really look like. And I think it was a major step forward, not only for the US, but for the world. That's in my perspective.
Good closing comments. I just want to thank Deborah Dandridge and Dr. Terri Finneman for giving us their time this morning, and thank Deb Miller and all of you at the Institute for Women in Public Administration for giving us the time to show you our centennial exhibit. I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from that centennial. And I had more fun than anybody taking that exhibit around, showing it to people, seeing how they reacted to it, and realizing that Kansas has a marvelous history of strong women being involved and doing great things. And we need to continue that. Thank you very much.
That was really terrific and a great way to close it out, Joan. And I agree. I'm always amazed when I learn a bit more about the history of Kansas, that we do in fact have this fantastic history of strong women. And also to all of you, one of the things I have regularly been struck by is how little we understand our own history and how problematic that is. So today it felt like we just got our toes wet, and Terri, I think we'd all like to take you up on your offer to spend, 90 minutes on just one or two of those topics. Deborah, it's just been fantastic having your voice involved. And I'm so happy to know you as a fellow Topekan. So, and Joan, as always, you just really did such a marvelous job pulling this together for us. So really just completely loved it. Thank you all so much.